Great. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to the EBF Town Hall. This is the second of this series here, and we're very fortunate today to have three great guests joining us who we'll introduce in just a moment. But for those who aren't familiar, the EBF, that is the Ecological Benefits Framework, has been developed in concert with the Lexicon and a number of different organizations and folks like these folks that you see here on the screen. We've been working on this a while, and just to give you the context, the Ecological Benefits Framework is a new paradigm. It provides a foundational architecture to radically transform global carbon and ecological benefits markets, both by increasing transparency, trust, quality, and equity, and by accelerating the coordinated delivery of positive financial and environmental impacts. By developing a shared framework, EBF can create alignment across public and private sectors to support the rapid deployment of strategic capital for activities that create measurable, life-affirming ecological impacts. The unprecedented coordination of financial markets, UN agencies, NGOs, companies, and philanthropic interests will bring attention to and help create a shared pathway for accelerated solutions. So, thanks so much again for joining us here, and we'll be diving right into today's topic. And today's topic is low tech and high tech, MRV for rigor and equity. And this is a topic probably that doesn't garner enough attention in a world that's swept up in the fast-paced developments of digital technologies being used to take the vitals of an ailing planet. These innovations are also tied to the worlds of finance and venture capital, as well as Web3, new concepts of currency and exchange, and even philanthropy. So we're taking a moment to reflect on the advantages and disadvantages, not just of high-tech innovation, but also of low-tech solutions. So there's an irony that in the push to design and develop projects focused on ecosystems and human communities, using all of our new tools and technologies, we might inadvertently be missing the boat by not focusing on indigenous ways of knowing, boots on the ground research, appropriate technologies for specific cultures and environments, and the limitations of financial resources. Not just for conducting research, but also for the upkeep and the upgrading of MRV equipment. But before we get there, we'll introduce our esteemed guest and hear a bit about how they began to think about this topic. So our three guests today, we have Genevieve Leveille, founder and CEO of AgriLedger, an agricultural blockchain systems provider with offices in the UK and Asia. She also is I love this title, Genevieve, the non-executive director of FinTech for International Development. She's a regional ambassador for Global Blockchain Business Council and advises a number of initiatives and organizations focused on blockchain, innovation, and equity. She's also internationally recognized for her work on equity, diversity, and inclusion. So we also have Ned Harvey, who you see here on the screen, and Ned is the Chief Executive Officer of Digital Gaia. He's based in Denver, Colorado. He's chair of the board of the Colorado Clean Tech Industries Association. He was previously the managing director of the Rocky Mountain Institute. Many of us know that as RMI, and also managing director of the Carbon War Room in DC. And finally, and last but not least, we have Ted Schmitt, who's the senior director of conservation at the Allen Institute for AI. And he also is the previous director of conservation at Vulcan, where he worked on conservation technology, which is a lot of what we're talking about today. And he was also the program officer for computer science and telecommunications at the National Academy of Sciences. So thank you all for joining. We're really excited to have each of you here and all of the different expertise that you bring. And as we dive in here, I just thought it would be interesting to get an anecdote from each of you, if you don't mind. And I'd like you to maybe give us just a moment where you were thinking about thinking about technology, thinking about the high-tech tools that we have for what we often call MRV, measurement, reporting, and verification, thinking about those, and then also, the equity that's associated with those. So perhaps, Genevieve, could I start with you, just thinking about high-tech equity and sort of an aha moment that you've had along the way here in that regard?
That technology does not need to be what we are defining. So I think sometimes we think people need to be in technology rather than on technology. So we are not building enough on how can technology serve communities And, I'm talking more from the aspect that I've been going in, which is in the blockchain technology and also financial services. So for me, the big aha moment was like, well, does that person really need to have a smartphone? Oh, they can have a dumb phone. What about if they have no phone at all? How do I recognize what this person has done? And really, what do they want to know? And at the end of the day, everybody wants to know that what I've done is recognized and what is my due and equitable return is made to me. And that allows me to be a better individual, or at least a happier individual. And I think that at the end of the day, the biggest aha was, not everybody wants to be rich. Everyone wants to be relaxed about being able to go through their lives because they can eat, they have a roof over their head, and they have their family near them. So if we start with those principles, then when we look at equitable distribution, then we can actually see what's in it for everyone.
Well, beautifully stated. Thank you so much, Genevieve. And Ted, you, just in terms of an anecdote here and thinking about high tech and equity, a moment in your career perhaps that's inspired you to think about this in a certain way.
Yeah, I could think of a lot. Where do I start? I guess I could start with when I first got into this space, which was around 2012, 2013, and showing up at some protected areas, parks in Kenya, and interacting with the people that live around those parks, and seeing that tech was people with literally with pencils and paper noting what animals were in the space, what was going on, sticking those pieces of paper on a shelf, and them never being used to help anyone. And so while many of us, and I'm at the Allen Institute for AI, and AI is a powerful tool. Things like drones, satellites, those things are all incredibly powerful tools that can help us understand what's going on in the environment, be able to invest in that. The people on the ground don't care about those things. They want action, and they don't. I like this title, low tech and high tech, because low tech can get us so very far. And so just being able to give people a way to be informed, say when an elephant is coming into, and maybe that's an anecdote, hearing from communities about elephants or lions coming into their community and them not having any warning or way to mitigate or push those animals back to where both the animals and the people would be safe. And then giving them some really basic tools to do that, flashing lights and things like that, as well as the information to say, hey, there's an elephant approaching that you need to be able to deal with, and giving those communities the agency to do that, moving off the pieces of paper to things that are actually in real time, without being sophisticated technology. And in fact, quite importantly, being affordable, durable, working in dust and dirt and all of those things. And then in the back, being able to take that data and apply all of those more sophisticated technologies to do bigger things. But the mix of low tech and high tech is really important. So I'll stop there.
Great. Well, thank you, Ted. So it's not always the elephant in the room. Sometimes it's the elephant outside of the room, I guess we have to think about. Yeah.
Indeed.
Great. And Ned, how about you?
Yeah, or sometimes it's just common sense.
That's right.
I had probably three seminal moments in my time while at RMI over 12 years that sort of led me to where I am today. The one that got me on this specific topic related to methane emissions in the oil and gas industry, where I was part of a global group of people that were trying to figure out how do we work with industry to do this. And the entire conversation ended up being around MRV, and the entire conversation ended up being about how do we spend billions of dollars to put satellites in the air to figure out what's going on in the oil and gas industry. And yet, if you've ever talked to a petroleum engineer or anybody who's ever spent a day in the industry, they know exactly where every single leak is and why it's there. And the reason that I observe that happen is because there is this false need for rigor and false need for science a lot of times that is often driven because it obscures and makes it hard to get to the truth. And it's often in a legal or compliance construct, and therefore pushes for things that aren't necessarily the most common sense or efficient way to do things in a voluntary or do it for the right reasons world. And so I think that there are systemic challenges that drive this mental model, and whether it's indigenous knowledge or whatever, there's a common sense set of activities that one needs to take to figure out what the right thing to do is where and whether it's working. And that should be where we start, and then build more complicated methods for, compliance or whatever reasons you have. But there is usually a much cheaper and simpler way to get to the answer that matters.
Awesome. Great. And we'll get back to that rigor question, Ned, that you bring out so well, and dive into that a little bit further. But first, maybe Genevieve, I think maybe could you help us discern the difference as you might see it? And you have a background where you grew up in Haiti, and have that perspective as well. Just as we're thinking about low tech and high tech, I mean, is there a way that you kind of discern the two in some fashion? We should be thinking about.
So one of the things is I'm actually going to take the time that I spent in finance. So my background is many years working with banking. And prior to that, I was actually doing research. So really working in research, both in beta-lactamase, which is drugs that keep you from getting infections when you're in the hospital, or also cancer. So I worked in ovarian cancer. And sometimes we think that high tech is what we're doing. And I so agree with this whole idea that a pen and paper is also part of the technology. So this is where fundamentally, I think we need to look at outcomes, desired outcomes, and what are the steps that it needs to take. And that's when I was doing finance and we were implementing system, it could be that you actually, what we call the swivel chair effect, or the post-it note effect, where you were taking information from one place to the other. So being able to chart those help us to then understand, one, is there a need for an improvement of this? Because sometimes what we may think could be very well served with a digital format is actually not the best way, because you're then missing that interaction many a time between individual to create that trust, because we do not understand machines and machines do not understand us. But when someone has had, for whatever reason, a bad day, and for me, it could be I didn't have time to eat, I'm going to be reacting differently than if I was just interacting with a machine. An individual in that moment can actually interact better with me. So I think we need to look at systematic approach, which means understanding fundamentally what are the interaction that need to happen within individual, with system, or just nothing should happen. And even nothing is also a decision.
Wow. Oh, that's so well put, Genevieve. Thank you so much. And I wonder, as we're diving into this a bit further, Ted, a lot of the conservation work that you've been doing in Africa and elsewhere is related to helping to bridge this divide between the low tech realities and the high tech possibilities. So how would you describe the difference?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Ned brought up some great points just now. About what are the motivations sometimes for saying you need rigor, or you need a certain levels of data. And I guess I always start with asking why. Why is someone motivated to do something? Why do they want? What do they want to achieve? If I'm a community member, what I want is I want security, I want safety. I want to be able to have some agency to be able to manage. I don't know or care about necessarily about satellites and AI and all of those things. I just need the information that I need, and I need to be able to provide information as well. And that can be, as Genevieve said, something as simple as being able to tell someone. And I think that issue of trust is really, really important. We can't do this from afar. We have to be able to build those trust relationships. It can be things like we've done, where you do provide someone with an app so that they can report information, but you use iconography, because if someone isn't literate, they still have a way. And I've seen people's eyes light up when they realize that they can now tell someone what's happening in their space because they have a basic tool for how to do that. That sense of agency builds trust. It creates a data flow. And then, if I'm the technology provider, and I could tell you a lot of the high tech space, there's a lot of good people that want to help, but they want to help by providing the solutions that they have, or because they're excited about some tech that they have, some AI, or they want to bring satellites, or they want to bring drones. Drones were a disaster in Africa. That we're going to protect all the animals with drones, and without any understanding of operationally what would happen on the ground. Simple things like supply chain to repair things, people to fly the things that didn't have to be flown in from the US or Europe to do that. I mean, talk about not building trust. So those are like, how can we train the people on the ground to be able to use the technology we do bring to provide the data that we actually do need? And then, back to Ned's point, what is it we're trying to achieve with that information? If I'm a scientist, I want to get the very deepest details so I can do my scientific evaluation. If I want to invest in conservation and invest the people that live in the areas where biodiversity is safe, then sorry, I'm getting a little echo there. Then I don't care about scientific rigor. I care about enough information to make the right conservation decision. And those are two very different levels of data. And Ned, I love that you pointed out that desire for obfuscation to make things complicated, because in fact, look at some people's motivations. They don't want this stuff to happen. So they make it as hard as possible. And we need to fight that. And we need to say, no, actually, that's not what we need. We need decision making here. And for that, we need this level of data. So I'll pause there.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you, Ted. And then Ned, maybe to follow up on this, you've been working with groups like Savimbo in Colombia. We had Drea Burbank with us last week, and you've been working with them to utilize appropriate technologies that can advance projects like theirs with indigenous communities. And I know in EBF and our discussions, you brought out this topic of appropriate technologies, previously. So what do you consider to be appropriate technologies? How can folks out there understand that best?
Well, again, let me frame this. I like to think about, I was just writing a chat, I'll post in a second, but we have to realize we're operating in complex dynamic systems where everything is context specific. The dynamics that happen in one place are totally dependent on the initial conditions in that place. So what happens here is not going to be what happens there. They're nonlinear. And they're they change over time. So the way something worked yesterday is not necessarily the way it's going to work today. So in a case like Savimbo, which is trying to basically deploy scientifically backed, relatively well understood and thought through practices in a place, compliance organizations are trying to force them to report and comply with very sort of broad concepts of performance assessment and compliance MRV. That's fine. That's their right to do it. But what Drea and I and others are trying to figure out is what's the right thing to do in this place, and what's the right way to figure out if it's working, and what's the right way to communicate and to get people engaged in continuing to invest in this, because we are proving out that we are improving the local ecosystem and improving people's lives, et cetera. So the question is, what do we need to do to measure that? And so rather than instrument every field with instrumentation and try to figure out how to backhaul all that data to some central place, which is an incredibly expensive thing to do, Potentially, it's the fact that are they planting the right trees? Can we verify somehow that those trees are in fact growing at the right time and place and are not at risk to the kinds of things that cause projects to fail in that given place? And so what we did is to deploy basically a smart set of integrated tools that related from gathering data from the primary farmers, correlating that data with other free third-party information, and looking at satellites and some other things to say, does this all make sense? Is there anything that we see here that would indicate that they are not doing what they're supposed to be doing, that in fact this isn't, that this is growing the way it's supposed to grow, and then therefore sequestering the carbon, and et cetera, et cetera. It's more complicated with biodiversity, et cetera. But that's what we try to do. And Drea found one that allowed her to have much more effective conversations with investors, to open up opportunities for new investment, because people were willing to invest in some side benefits because they weren't looking for compliance, carbon and all that stuff, and see a pathway to faster mobilization of investment into biodiversity and things like that. So again, it's the common sense causal. What are the causal behaviors and causal patterns in this place versus, revisiting the science on whether plants grow or not grow, or whether wildfires happen or don't happen. Just one comment I want to make on indigenous knowledge, because it's really important. How do we incorporate indigenous knowledge? And it has to be on their terms, but also in a case like wildfires in the Amazon, the indigenous people have not experienced wildfires in the Amazon. They don't see it. And how can we help them understand? There are some outside technologies that you're not familiar with that might help you understand what the increasing wildfire risks are in this place, and learn to combine those two bits of knowledge to say, how do we in fact protect our projects and protect our land from wildfire risks, knowing what we know from the past, but also what we know about what's likely to happen in the future. And that's another piece of this conversation that we're not talking about enough, because the world is changing around us, and no matter how long you've lived there, and no matter how much indigenous knowledge you have, that's changing. And so we've got to figure out how to help indigenous peoples also advance their knowledge on their own terms.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd love to,
Genevieve,
right here we can.
Ned, I'm looking forward to have this conversation on a one-on-one. I think that as a reform scientist and also a reform banker, I think that sometimes what we forget to do, and this is where fundamentally I have a challenge with the market, or what's happening right now, in that we are taking knowledge, or we are creating opportunity for, I would say, a resource, which is money, which creates different other resources. But we are not making sure to have an equitable redistribution to those communities which are affected. That's one aspect. The other thing is that, and this is where as a scientist I come in, we come in with a certain, for lack of a better word, arrogance of knowledge. And one of the projects I actually worked in with the European Union last year was looking at how do you bifurcate what the scientist knows, what the farmer knows, and what also the history of what they've been doing brings in, or it could be the agronomists and all of those, to then be able to bring that data and create knowledge. Not only because where there's a challenge is that we're trying to do knowledge in one way and not take that secondary knowledge and actually create new knowledge from there. And I would like to actually say that right now, another challenge I have in a nature base, it seems to be really just looking at how can we get more trees? How is not getting the trees cut down the biggest thing, rather than looking, how can I make food happen at the same time as the tree? Mm-hmm. How can I bring in appropriate technology to remove the need? And in reality, we keep saying those fires are bad. Those fires used to happen, and we're going through a global change right now, a weather change, which has happened in the past. And what is there that we can learn, and how can we take that knowledge from indigenous people and start making it part of what we do? When we did the project in Haiti, we learned so much more. We had what the market wants, and then what the people on the ground were doing. So if we can start balancing that, we can then get to a middle ground, which allows, but I think in getting to that middle ground, part of the challenge I have with many of these MRVs is that they're not showing how the money is actually going back to the community and supporting the community in being able to survive.
Yes.
Yeah, 100%.
As I said, I just would add on to that, Genevieve. I always ask that question: how is the money flowing back to the communities at the end of this? Like, where are these investments going to go? Who are they going to benefit? And if at least a portion of the proceeds don't benefit the people on the ground, then the very people who are essentially charged with delivering the results are not actually receiving any of the benefits. Well, I don't think anyone would argue that that's not going to work economically. That's not going to create a viable market very long. So I always ask that question. I never feel like I get a very good answer of how are the benefits of market-based investments going to flow back to the people charged with actually protecting and delivering on the results that we all think we want. And then another point Genevieve made, sustainable use is sometimes, there are a lot of conservationists that don't like that term sustainable use, but in fact, that's the only way we're going to actually deliver long-term results in biodiversity, is to find ways. Yes, we'll have parks that are preserved and have very limited use, but we won't have many of those. We'll have a lot more mixed use. And I give an example of where there are pastoralists in northern Kenya that are grazing lands, and they're doing that by and large sustainably, with guidance, with support, and creating a conservation landscape. At the same time, they're using it to maintain themselves through managed grazing and so on. That's right now really hard to do. It should be easier to do those things. There should be ways to report those things, and for those communities to benefit from those things through investment.
Yeah, Phil, can I jump in just real quick?
Yep, please.
Well, that was one of the other seminal moments at RMI relates to this equitable distribution of funds. And sometimes it always doesn't come in the form of equity, but in the early days of the solar markets, when everybody's focused on trying to make solar cheaper, essentially you could have had free solar, but nobody was going to put solar on their facilities because they couldn't figure out what's in it for me. And, the entire world was looking at cost engineering solar systems or making solar systems more efficient. And the reality was, how do you make the financing of these things so efficient that it becomes very easy for somebody to see through the difficulty and pain of putting a solar system on your house or on your building, to actually start thinking about why this would be good for me and my business. And it was the single biggest sort of revelation that changed the markets and actually launched the renewable energy markets as they are today, helped a little bit by tax policy. But when I look at the environmental markets, whether they're markets or just straight out investment and doing the right thing, that's where the problem is. It's just simply too expensive and too hard. The friction of getting your way around it, and that friction comes mostly because a bunch of outsiders are trying to define how this should be rather than it coming out of the communities themselves, and compliance. And so I think of this thing we're talking about right now is actually the set of technologies that define the future of clean tech and environmental markets and all that stuff, not the actual underlying things like regenerative ag, because you can have all the regenerative ag you want. And if it's too hard to get projects going and get finance flowing into that, they don't matter. And these are the soft paths, not the hard paths that nobody ever wants to talk about.
So would you say, though, this is why I think EBF is so important. The first thing to be able So let's think of the Tower of Babel. The first thing to be able to get to the same path is to be able to speak the same language. And
100%.
Yep.
and so this is why this is so important. And my sister actually sent me the article with the New Yorker today, and I was trying to read it before our talk. And what really came to me was the lack of communication across, which created cross pathways.
Guess who that works for?
Yeah, you know what? There
Yeah.
is quite a few people who want to have that, because through this lack of transparency, you can create opportunities to gain greater wealth. However, if we want to be able to have the indigenous provide us with information, or we want the financier to provide us with the funding that is necessary, we need to make it simple, or get together to that complexity by speaking the same language. Right now, you're just hearing everything and everywhere. And because of that, you then get people saying, well, you were lying. No, you weren't lying. You were saying it in your way. And unfortunately, because I see this as really because of the tax incentive becoming the new gold, the new OTC, over the counter commodity, there is a lot of bad behavior. It's like the gold rush. Until it got to be regulated and people were knowing what they were getting, it was everywhere and nowhere at the same time.
Yep. I just comment, I agree 100% on EBF as a critical element of the core infrastructure, but it is a part of an intersecting set of core infrastructure that I call market infrastructure that's necessary. So language, information, we have to reinvent the market infrastructure. And I think EBF is a shot across the bow at how it can be done.
This is Ted. I would agree with that. I think one word that I often hear and use, and that I think you're saying, is we need to disintermediate the experts, the auditors, all the people that create a business around being the so-called experts and doing the translation, doing it badly, and frankly siphoning off most of the money that the investors put in that never get to the people in the field. And I think that's the role that EBF plays. It's absolutely not the be all end all, but it is a critical foundational element of disintermediating all the so-called experts and allowing the market to thrive, because the information can flow easily. Friction was another word Ned used. There's lots of and we need to remove that friction, and I think EBF is part of doing that.
Right. So just building on that, next infrastructure is we currently are built on infrastructure that's centralized for infrastructure for trust and authority for centralized. We have to develop infrastructure for decentralized trust and authority.
So, but what happens is that I will take it a bit further to say we also need to improve our data storage capacities, because we are, I'm in the blockchain space, and I think blockchain has an opportunity to be that trustless, or part of the trustless mechanism. But it's only one of the fraction. And I think one of the things that, I'm very happy of the so-called revolution of AI coming to front in the consciousness. But because in reality, some of us have been talking about, now that you have data that you say you can trust, what are the information that you can then make use of to understand what are the breakpoints? What are your early warnings of things that need to be done to actually mitigate any potential loss? And what I'm worried about is that we're going down the road of ledgering, which is just a point in time writing. And what is very important is not only what has been ledgered, but what are the qualifying aspect or the information, such as where is it coming from, when was it done, who was part of it. So that qualitative data, which then gives you also the trust of knowledge that it's been done right, and also that it's been verified in a right way. And I think that we also need to get away from this idea that everything has to be looked at 100. We have to look at 100 to be satisfied. We should be looking at how do we employ such things as Six Sigma in our systematic approaches so that we can stop wasting money and actually make things be more valuable. You can do spot checks, you can do surprise check, and be able to understand, is the system or the systematic approach of reporting that I've put in place actually delivering, or do I have a problem? So we need to take that, going back to that systematic approach, by really starting to map out what is expected, what is happening, and where are the points of improvement that we can get to. But the first part about it, to me, is what has been happening with EBF, which is having the language and then being able to break down what exactly do we need to do as the next step.
And on that point in part, Genevieve, what I'd love to ask the three of you is, we're talking about this need to find ways to be more transparent about where the funding, the resources are going, the degree to which they're going back to those stewards. I'm curious in terms of EBF and trying to express that, if you've got particular ideas of things that we need to make sure we get across, or ways in which we do that with EBF, in terms of showing that transparency, showing where that funding is actually going back to. So
I am wondering if we need, so we have some metrics at this time that we tend to use, which are the SDGs. But the SDGs are not qualitative enough. They're quantitative. So I'm helping women and children. What does that actually mean? I'm doing something about innovation and jobs and things like that. What are the actual point that are being captured? And how can I then show both the direct and the indirect? So what we need to get to is to the conversation of really getting to SDGs, to now not being just a badge, but having a mechanism for measuring, to say, am I just talking about it, or am I actually delivering on it?
Mm-hmm. Well, and I hope that's what's coming out of the digital fingerprint that we're developing here for EBF, is that ability to both convey the quantitative, as you say, is that point in time, those data points, and then also the qualitative aspects that really represent, the more holistic aspects of that. So, and Ted, I wonder if you've got thoughts there, just in terms of how we actually show where these both direct and indirect benefits, come into play.
Direct and indirect benefits of?
In terms of the projects and the benefits going back to the stewards, to the communities, to those who are really generating the real wealth, not necessarily financial.
And it's so interesting because, of course, the people that do these investments today, which frankly are governments that have certain policy goals, or philanthropists that have their own goals, how they measure impact, how they value what has happened, may be very different than how markets value those things. And so I think we have to be really careful. I want to be really careful about that. In fact, I think that's one of the things I'm hoping that we overcome with EBF and all the other tools that everyone's putting. Markets are much more efficient. If they function, they're much more efficient at evaluating value. And of course, what we're dealing with, and it's something that's not said nearly enough, is we're dealing with market failures here. Conservation, all the impacts to nature that across the 6 pillars of EBF. they haven't been incorporated. I don't know if we lost Ned there. They haven't been incorporated into. They've been treated as externalities in the economic system, and so how do we incorporate those into the into the global economic system and value them appropriately? And so I don't know if the lessons that I have from philanthropy and government funding in these spaces is actually a good one, because they value different things. They have different goals. And I think that's exactly what we're trying to address, is to get the potential efficiencies of market valuation to be recognized. And maybe the critical thing here in this context is that the value that local communities, that people that live in the areas, whether it's in ag or in my world in biodiversity areas and conservation areas, the people that live there, the people that manage those spaces, rarely benefit to the degree of the value they're delivering into those spaces. And I guess that would be my goal, is that those folks benefit to the level of the value they're bringing into the spaces. And that's almost never true with the kind of funding we have today.
But wouldn't that be what we call equitable distribution? Because
Genevieve, it's exactly, which is why I was so fascinated by this topic, is that we don't have equitable distribution because the money is not flowing in equitable ways. And in fact, even let's leave equitable out. It's not flowing in efficient ways to actually deliver the results and that happens to be equitable too. Lovely coincidence. So there you go.
No, what I would actually add is that the fundamental, though, I think, in equity is sometimes, and we measure everything in a dollar amount, or let's say in a money amount. It's about services. So I think that there is also, I would suggest, it's almost this idea of don't make somebody too rich too fast is something that we sometimes as capitalists come in. So do we need to start really looking at the idea of compassionate capitalism, which means also recreating this idea of entrepreneurship at those level of those communities, giving them access to those markets that they need to, and giving them access to either the financial market or the services that they need. I've been incensed lately by the latest requirement of the European Union, which is going to be things like coffee, cocoa, wood are going now to need to demonstrate that there's been no deforestation and no child labor. I think that it's almost an arrogance from our part to talk about child labor. Yeah. Because 40 years ago, many of us did not have the mechanism to actually be living in society where school was part of the benefits that you receive. So is that something that we need to bring them? Because the reality is, if you have a child who's in your feet, you're going to make him busy. And if right now we give iPad to our kids to keep them busy, to get them out of our head. If you have a farm, what you're going to do is you're going to make the child do some work, because that's how you're going to tire him out. So we need to also start translating people's reality into people's reality and not our reality. And also as societies, make sure that our governments are not putting undue stress, because the fundamental issue of those new laws, which are going to be taken not by the EU only, but everybody else, is going to create further stress on those communities to deliver a product which they're already underpaid for at a higher price, which is never going to be given back to them. So I think that the equity issue of the carbon market is secondary to the lack of equity that we have in the food system, in that we rely on them to feed us. Because if you're wanting strawberry in the middle of the time that there's no strawberry, there's somebody doing it for you. If we're having banana every day, it's the guy in Costa Rica who's paying for us to have that cheap banana. So we need to start rethinking.
You know, Genevieve, you're making a great point here that for a lot of us, equity is, or I hope to not put myself in this category, but making equity be about opposing our values on other people is so very wrong. And I think, and that's really hard because people have deeply held values and beliefs. And they're like, well, we want to help, but we're going to do that. We're going to impose our values on those folks. Well, that's not actually equitable at all. And I wanted to make another point here that is very challenging, but I have seen where if it's money that's delivered, and Genevieve, you made this sort of on the side here, but if it's money that's delivered to preserve a place, often that money ends up in the hands of one or a small number of people. And suddenly a big house pops up in the middle of, a rural pastoralist community and a fancy car, and the rest of the community continues at the level they're at. And so if instead of delivering money to somehow be distributed, and it's like, oh, well, I just want to give it to this one person, they can figure it out. Well, that doesn't actually work. So did I lose everyone or?
Oh, I think the camera just changed.
Okay. It's really like, if you ask some of these communities, what they want security. They want education for their children. They want, they want clean water, things like this. And they don't, and they may need help to figure out how to get those things delivered. If you say, well, here's the money, you figure that out. Well, that you haven't solved the problem at all, because the money will end up being not distributed. You will have moved where the inequity happens, but you won't have changed the inequity equation at all.
You're right in some ways, but so what I was going to say to you, though, it depends on how you redo that redistribution and how you recreate that trust within the community. So my suggestion is actually against giving it to one person. If you're not able to distribute it across the community, then what is it that the community needs?
I completely agree. And there are places, Genevieve, at least in my experience in Africa, where there are like community resource boards that are run by the community elects the leaders to those, and they do a fantastic job of making sure the entire community benefits. So you have to, and of course, this is what markets don't like to hear, because like, well, you have to go case by case by case and understand on this case, this is how we do it. In this case, with this community, this is how we do it. And yeah.
But this is why I was talking about the Six Sigma effect also. Yes, we can. Because what happens is that we try to do one size fit all. We say, here's the technology and it works this way. We need to understand that here's the blueprint, and then we place it. What that does is, yes, it takes longer to get there, but you then are assuring success. What we tend to do is go here, 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 and then we wonder, why is it working here and why it's not working there?
Yeah.
Why? Because you didn't take the time to actually have that communication with that enclave and understand, because one of the things also, you may actually learn in one community how it's done to then bring it back to the other one and supporting them and create larger community. One of the things I've found, like, let's say in the whole aspect of Web3, we talk about creating communities, but again, there, I'm finding that it's kind of like at the top and not looking how do you create that circularity, which I think now we have the mechanism to do it. And what we have to be cognizant of is now even the guy in the middle of the bush. And so could be a seminal moment in the middle of the mountains in Kenya for me. I had a guy who sold to me a shawl and asked me to basically pay him with M-Pesa. So there is awareness, and people will use the tool which fits their need, and they will learn how to adapt in order to be able to be more successful. And somebody was at the beginning, I was going about what is richness. Richness is not always money. Richness is peace of mind. It is knowing that tomorrow I will be okay. Tomorrow I will not have to worry about being able to eat, about being able to feed my child, and that I will be able to be among my community.
Right. Well, and it's interesting, and my hope is that EBF really allows for that expression, of the community intentions to come forwards, and not always to be intermediated, as we were talking about earlier, so that we really can get to these different points of value and what comes out of these projects, and whether they're financial or otherwise for the different people, in particular the stewards. But I think you bring that out so well, Genevieve. And I wonder here, we do have one question, and we're closing in on time, and Utkarsh has been very patient with us here, and with the discussion, and he's wondering about ecosystem services, which we are calling ecological benefits, and the technologies that are out there with regard to actually helping to discern those. And Ned has replied in the chat, which is really helpful. Thank you there, Ned. But I'm wondering, as we look at the ecological benefits, as we put them forward through EBF, are there particular benefits that are especially that in particular need this high-tech approach in order to measure? Or in fact, you can turn that on its head as well. Are there also some of these benefits that we can utilize more of the low-tech technologies in order to actually begin to measure those and put those into the MRV context?
So I think the challenge with environmental digital assets, the way they're structured today, is they are a credit for what is supposed to be a hard asset. And in order to connect the credit to a hard asset, you've got to know that that hard asset exists in the world. That's pretty easy for an ounce of gold, and it's pretty easy for a barrel of oil. It is ludicrously hard for a ton of carbon. It might be easier for a gallon of clean water, but as those assets get more a human construct, if you will, it is going to be expensive.
Talk about how do you value how many elephants are in the ecosystem, right?
Yeah, that I can get my head around that. I cannot get my head around a ton of carbon, and I don't care how often you drive. And again, we let the accountants wag the tail here. And if you can't account for something, you shouldn't try. Or if you can't count something, you shouldn't try. But this gets into maybe a different topic. But yeah. So hey, we've sort of set the system up to make progress.
No, but isn't it, though, Ned? Sometimes it's about do we all agree that there is a value, intrinsic value, and we actually get
real estate, great market for that. Trump's got one I mean, real estate is a very efficient, liquid market, and there aren't that many Donald Trumps in it. Well, there's a ton of them. There's a ton of them, but they don't move the global market, right? They have their little spots where they're allowed to exist or whatever.
And I think this is where we need to, actually get to. And I think systematic aspect of recording will help in that. And my whole aspect of my point of view is we need to start looking at those assets in the same way as we do a tree, an apple tree, or a tomato grower, and saying, where is it being grown? So I'll take an example, rice. Rice in certain parts of the world, such as in Heilongjiang, China, in Spain, where they grow the adobe rice, those have a certain richness of soil, which makes that rice glutinous really exquisite. So now, if we start looking at these creation of these assets, by understanding, as I said, the underlying qualitative levers, we can then kind of look at it even like a piece of art. Is this a Picasso or is this a wannabe Picasso? And is that wannabe Picasso eventually improve enough to be in the same level as Picasso in the same demand? And that's where the market starts having. Right now, the market is stupid because it just takes everything
That's
without
very
knowing.
capitalistic of you, Genevieve. You're basically saying, I mean, others would want to say, no, I'm telling you what's good rice. And it's from Central Valley, California, the best rice in the world.
No, but
I agree.
Is it capitalist? You see, but this is one part of the equation. And it's why I'm saying it needs to be many parts. Yes, the California part can make it. And the part about the California is going to be, because I know there are laws which are going to keep me safe, versus in the wild, wild west of a place like Haiti. I don't know who was looking at it. So those are things that we can start looking and also start equating with technology such as satellite. What people forget is the European Space Agency has been giving us for the last 20 years, and we got more of Sentinel giving us data. Yeah, you got to figure out what the data is telling you, but you don't need to be blind. So let's start using, we've been talking open source for the last 20 years. Let's start using open source to really create.
Well, Genevieve, you're going to make my program sound really good then, because we just took Sentinel-1 data, and we now, on a global basis, every single day, millions of images. And what do? We run computer vision algorithms on it to detect vessels at sea that are doing things they're not supposed to be doing. So there's a great application of very sophisticated technology. I think the message for me is, and we have Earth Ranger, which does the simplest, the iconographic mode. You need the whole range of technology, and you need to apply it in the right ways at the right times, and not get enamored with the solutions, but understand the problems deeply, and then bring the right technology, the right solutions to those problems. And Philip, I have to do it, and have a common language within which everyone can explain all of those things. So there you go. How's that?
That's perfect. That's where we're all at. And the perfect point to wrap up too. And I have to say, you've set us up well for next week, everyone, as we'll be talking about qualitative and quantitative data, and both the tension between those, and then also how they're complementary, and that I think will really help us continue this conversation and delve even deeper here. But I'm really very, very grateful, Ned, Genevieve, and Ted, for joining us here. This has been a fantastic discussion, and I am glad that we landed heavily on equity, because that's exactly what we need to be doing. And, I think we really rounded that conversation out nicely in order to start another conversation. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank everyone who joined us here. And I hope that you'll join us next week for the EBF Town Hall. So thanks so much. Appreciate it. And everyone be well. We'll look forward to the next conversation. Take care all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Great. And if you all could hang